The limestone
Charge! Keep
caves of
moving!
southern Okinawa
Whoa!
held
On your
secrets
feet!
older
Through
than
the wire,
nations.
go!
For millions of years, water had carved chambers beneath the coral ridges, creating labyrinths that now sheltered the dying and the desperate. In one such cave, barely 3 kilometers from Shuri Castle, Yoshiko Tanaka knelt on cold stone and tried to remember what her hands had once been trained to do. She was 24 years old. In another life, she would have been teaching literature to middle school students in Osaka, discussing the poetry of Basho and the novels of Soseki with children who fidgeted in wooden desks. Instead, her hands moved by lantern light, wrapping bandages torn from her own undergarments around the shattered leg of a soldier who would not live to see morning. The date was April 28, 1945. The Battle of Okinawa had been raging for nearly a month. Outside the cave, the world had become incomprehensible. The Americans had landed on April 1st with a force so vast it seemed to cover the ocean itself. Yoshiko had watched from the hills as the armada approached, hundreds of ships stretching to the horizon, and she had understood with terrible clarity that everything her government had told her was a lie. They were not going to win this war. They had never been going to win. But understanding the truth and accepting it were different things entirely. The Imperial Japanese Army had drafted her along with 222 other young women from the Okinawa Normal School. They called themselves the Himeyuri Student Corps, named after the Princess Lily that bloomed in peaceful times. Most of them were teenagers. The youngest was 15. Their training had lasted 3 days. Bandaging techniques, how to boil instruments in salt water when there was no proper equipment, how to administer morphine though they had run out of morphine in the second week, how to comfort dying men with lies about victory and honor. No one had trained them for what was actually happening. The soldier whose leg she was wrapping had been brought in 2 hours earlier by his squad mates. Artillery shrapnel had torn through his femur, and Yoshiko could see bone fragments white against torn muscle. The cave's senior nurse, an older woman named Kimura, who had actually worked in hospitals before the war, had looked at the wound and turned away. "Make him comfortable," was all she said. Yoshiko knew what that meant. In a real hospital, this man might live. They would have surgery and blood transfusions and sterile conditions. Here they had cave water and cloth strips and prayers to the emperor. The soldier's name was Takeshi. He was 19. He kept calling for his mother. "Rest now," Yoshiko whispered, holding a cup of water to his cracked lips. "You have served with honor." Takeshi's eyes found hers in the dim light. "Are we winning?" The lie came automatically. Of course, the Americans will soon retreat. But Takeshi was not fooled. Perhaps the nearness of death brought clarity. "My mother lives in Kumamoto," he said. His voice was growing weaker. "If you survive this, if you go home, will you tell her I thought of her?" Yoshiko felt something crack inside her chest. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Tell her I tried to be brave." "I will tell her you were the bravest soldier I ever knew," Yoshiko said. And this was not a lie, because what else mattered now? Takeshi died 20 minutes later, still calling for his mother. Yoshiko sat beside his body for a long time after listening to the percussion of artillery that never seemed to stop. The cave trembled with each explosion. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. Somewhere deeper in the chamber, another wounded soldier was screaming. She pulled out the small notebook she had been keeping hidden in her medical bag. It was against regulations, but Nurse Kimura had seen it weeks ago and said nothing. Perhaps she understood that some things needed to be remembered, even if only in secret. April 28, 1945. Yoshiko wrote, "Takeshi died today. He wanted his mother. They all want their mothers. The Americans are closing in. I can hear their tanks now, not just the artillery. Some of the girls are talking about the cliffs, about what we should do if capture comes. I do not know what to believe anymore." The propaganda had been specific and relentless. American soldiers were demons in human form. They raped and tortured. They took pleasure in desecrating the bodies of Japanese women. Death by one's own hand was not just acceptable, but honorable in the face of such monsters. 3 of the Himeyuri girls had already thrown themselves from the cliffs at Mabuni. Others carried grenades not for fighting, but for themselves. Yoshiko had a small blade hidden in her sleeve, and she tried not to think about how and when she might use it. But there was something else, some small, stubborn part of her mind that remembered her literature classes, that remembered reading American authors in translation, Hemingway and Steinbeck, stories of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Could those people truly be the monsters she had been promised? She did not know, and not knowing terrified her almost as much as believing did. Across the island in a muddy foxhole dug into the red clay soil 300 meters from the cave where Yoshiko kept her vigil, Corporal Michael Chen tried to remember the last time he had been dry. It had been raining for 6 days straight, not the clean rain of his childhood in Sacramento, but thick tropical downpours that turned the volcanic soil into a sucking morass that pulled at boots and dragged down equipment and made every step forward a battle against the earth itself. Michael was 21 years old, Chinese-American, and very far from home. He had enlisted in January of 1943, partly from patriotism and partly to escape the internment camps where his Japanese-American friends had been sent. The irony of fighting Japanese soldiers while Japanese Americans rotted behind American wire was not lost on him. His unit, part of the 96th Infantry Division, had been pushing south for 3 weeks. The Japanese defenders had turned every ridge, every cave, every pile of rubble into a fortress. For every 100 yards gain, Michael had watched friends die. Good men. Men with families and futures and everything to live for. The Japanese were not surrendering. That was the thing that haunted Michael's nights. They fought until they died, and if dying alone was not enough, they took Americans with them. Grenades clutched to their chests as they charged, wounded soldiers playing dead until medics came close. Civilians throwing themselves from cliffs rather than face capture. It was madness. But it was also Michael was beginning to understand something else. Fear, perhaps, or honor, or some combination of the two that his American mind could not quite grasp. He had killed his first man 2 weeks into the campaign. A Japanese soldier had emerged from a spider hole not 10 feet away, and Michael's training had taken over. 3 shots from his M1 Garand center mass, and the soldier had fallen. Michael had vomited afterwards, shaking so hard his squad leader thought he had been hit. Since then, he had killed others. He did not know how many. He tried not to count. His squad leader, Sergeant Frank Morrison, was from Kentucky and had a philosophy about the Japanese that he shared frequently. They ain't like us, Chen. Don't forget that. They'd rather die than quit, and they'll take you with them if you give them half a chance. Stay sharp, stay mean, stay alive. Michael understood the logic, but he also understood that staying mean required believing the enemy was something other than human. And every time he saw a dead Japanese soldier who looked barely old enough to shave, that belief became harder to maintain. Tonight, they were dug in on a ridge overlooking what intelligence said was a network of cave hospitals. The plan was to move in at dawn, clear the caves, secure any prisoners and military supplies. The briefing had been clinical, professional. No one had mentioned that hospitals meant wounded. That wounded meant medics and nurses. That nurses meant women. Michael's platoon lieutenant, a bookish second lieutenant from Boston named David Palmer, gathered the squad leaders after the briefing. Geneva Convention applies, Palmer said quietly. These are medical personnel, not combat troops. Anyone who forgets that answers to me personally. Clear. Morrison spat tobacco juice into the mud. Clear as mud, sir. But if one of them comes at us with a grenade, all bets are off. If they come at you with a grenade, defend yourselves. But we're not animals. We're Americans. Act like it. Morrison had muttered something under his breath that Michael did not catch. But he noticed other soldiers nodding at the lieutenant's words. Good men, most of them. Men who wanted to go home and forget this island ever existed. Michael pulled out the waterproof pouch where he kept his letters and photographs. His mother's last letter was dated March 15th. She wrote about the garden she was planting, about his younger sister's upcoming graduation, about how the war news from Europe sounded promising. She asked when he would be coming home. Michael did not know how to answer that. The Pacific War felt endless, and island by island slogged toward a Japanese homeland that would have to be taken by force. The casualties would be astronomical. He tried not to think about the odds of surviving that long. Instead, he thought about what tomorrow would bring. The caves, the wounded, the possibility of prisoners who might include women and children. Morrison's philosophy was clear. Stay sharp, stay mean, stay alive. But Lieutenant Palmer's words echoed too. We're not animals, we're Americans. Michael wrote a quick letter to his mother by flashlight, keeping it light and optimistic. He told her the rain would stop eventually. He told her he was eating well and staying safe. He told her he loved her and would see her soon. All of it was lies except the last part. In a medical tent, 2 miles behind the front lines, Major Sarah Brennan, United States Army Nurse Corps, prepared for the morning's expected casualties with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen this before. Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima. Each island had its particular horrors, but the wounded always looked the same. Sarah was 32 years old enough that some of the younger nurses called her mother, though never to her face. She had enlisted in 1942 after her husband died at Pearl Harbor. Revenge had motivated her initially, but 2 years of war had burned that out of her. Now she just wanted it to be over. The tent smelled of disinfectant and blood and the particular sweetness of gangrene that no amount of ventilation could eliminate. They had 12 beds, which was a joke because they regularly treated 30 to 40 men per day. The overflow went on the floor. The ones who would not make it went to a separate tent to die with whatever morphine they could spare. Sarah's staff consisted of 3 other nurses, all younger, all dedicated, but increasingly hollow-eyed from exhaustion. They had been at this for 40 days with no break and no end in sight. The battle for Okinawa was turning into the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. Her head nurse, Lieutenant Catherine Morris from Georgia, was checking supplies when Sarah entered. "We're low on plasma again, and the morphine shipment that was supposed to come yesterday still hasn't arrived." "It will arrive when it arrives," Sarah said. "What do we have?" "Enough for maybe 20 serious cases. After that, we're improvising." Sarah nodded. Improvising was what they did best. The briefing said they're clearing caves at dawn, medical facilities. "We might get Japanese casualties." Catherine's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Her brother had died at Bataan. "Orders? Same as always. Treat based on need, not nationality. A wounded man is a wounded man." "And wounded women?" Sarah paused. The question was reasonable. Female prisoners were rare, but the intelligence reports mentioned the Haimyuri Student Corps, young women conscripted as nurses. Girls, really. "Same principle applies. We're medical professionals, not soldiers." Catherine nodded, but Sarah could see the conflict in her eyes. Professionalism versus personal grief. It was a line they all walked every day. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She lay on her cot listening to the artillery and thinking about the young women who might be in those caves. What would they think when Americans came? What stories had they been told? She had read the intelligence reports about Japanese propaganda, the systematic indoctrination teaching that Americans were savage beasts who raped and murdered. She had read about the mass suicides on Saipan civilians throwing themselves from cliffs rather than face capture. It made her sick. Not just the deaths, though those were tragedy enough, but the waste of it, the fear that drove people to such desperate acts. Sarah had grown up Quaker in Pennsylvania. Her parents had been pacifists who disapproved of her enlisting even after Pearl Harbor. They believed all war was wrong, all killing was sin. She had argued with them before shipping out, insisting that some evils had to be fought. Now, 3 years later, she was not sure what she believed anymore, except that suffering was real regardless of which flag you saluted, and healing was the only moral choice left to her. Tomorrow, the caves would be cleared. Tomorrow, she would probably treat Japanese wounded alongside American. Tomorrow, she would have to look into the eyes of young women who expected to be monsters and show them something different. Whether that would be enough to matter, she did not know. But she would try. Because what else was there? Dawn came to Okinawa on April 29th with the subtlety of artillery fire. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving everything coated in mud that steamed as the sun rose. Michael Chen crouched at the edge of the ridge, watching smoke rise from the valley below where the caves waited. The assault began at 0600 with a barrage designed to suppress any defenders. Michael knew that caves were nearly impossible to destroy with artillery, but the noise and fury served another purpose. Psychological, breaking the will to resist. His squad moved out at 0630, advancing in short rushes from cover to cover. Morrison led with Michael and 4 others following. Lieutenant Palmer coordinated from 50 yards back, radio operator beside him hauling in adjustments to the supporting fire. They reached the first cave entrance by 0700. Morrison tossed in a grenade, waited for the explosion, then went in with flashlight and pistol drawn. Michael followed M1 ready, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. The cave was empty except for abandoned medical supplies. Bandages, a few rusted instruments, empty bottles that might have held morphine once. Signs of hurried evacuation. They moved deeper. The second chamber held wounded. 5 Japanese soldiers in various states of trauma, too injured to move lying on straw pallets. One of them reached weakly for a grenade and Morrison shot him without hesitation. The others just watched with dead eyes. "Get a medic," Morrison ordered. "Palmer wants prisoners." Michael went back outside, feeling sick. The wounded man Morrison had shot could not have been more than 18. The grenade was still in his hand, but Michael did not know if he would have actually used it or just wanted to die with some dignity. It did not matter now. Deeper in the cave network, Yoshiko heard the explosions and knew it was over. The Americans had come. Around her, the remaining Himayuri girls huddled together, some praying, some silent, all terrified. Nurse Kimura stood at the chamber entrance, her face composed but her hands shaking. "Listen to me," she said. "We are medical personnel, non-combatants. The Geneva Convention protects us." "The Americans do not care about conventions," someone whispered. "They will do what they do." "We do not know that," Kimura said, but her voice lacked conviction. Yoshiko felt the weight of the blade in her sleeve. She thought about Takeshi calling for his mother. She thought about the Hemingway stories she had read in school about young men lost in war. She thought about her own mother in Osaka, who might still believe her daughter was safe, and she made a decision. "I'm going to surrender," Yoshiko said quietly. The other girls stared at her as if she had gone mad. "They will kill you," someone said, "or worse." "Maybe," Yoshiko acknowledged that. "But if I die by my own hand, I will never know if that is true. And if it is not true, then I will have killed myself for a lie." She stood up, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. Nurse Kimura grabbed her arm. "Think about this." "I have thought about nothing else for days." Yoshiko pulled away gently. "I am going to walk out of this cave with my hands up. If they kill me, you will know. If they do not, perhaps you will follow." She moved toward the entrance before her courage could fail. Behind her, she heard whispers, gasps, someone crying. She did not look back. The morning sun blinded her after the cave's darkness. She raised her hands high, walking slowly, every sense alert for the bullet that would end her. A voice shouted in English. She did not understand the words, but recognized the tone. "Stop. Show yourself. Identify." Yoshiko kept her hands up and kept walking. Into the light, into the unknown, into whatever came next. Michael Chen was the first to see her. A small figure emerging from the cave, mouth hands raised, wearing what looked like a nurse's uniform, stained with mud and blood. Not holding a weapon, not running, just walking toward them with terrible, slow purpose. "Hold fire," Lieutenant Palmer shouted. "Medical personnel, hold your fire." Morrison had his rifle aimed. "Could be a trick." "It's a girl, Morrison. Look at her. She's terrified." The figure kept coming, close enough now that Michael could see her face. Young, maybe his age. Eyes wide with fear, but also something else. Determination, perhaps. Or resignation. "Chen," Palmer said. "You speak any Japanese?" "No, sir, just Chinese." "Close enough. Get up there and secure her. Search for weapons, but be gentle. She's a prisoner of war under the convention." Michael moved forward, rifle lowered but ready. The girl stopped about 10 feet away, still holding her hands up. Her whole body was shaking. "It is okay," Michael said in English, speaking slowly and softly as if to a frightened animal. "No one will hurt you. You are safe now." The girl's expression shifted, confusion maybe, or disbelief. Michael realized she probably did not speak English. He gestured for her to turn around. She did, moving slowly. He patted her down quickly, professionally, and found a small blade in her sleeve. He removed it and held it up for Palmer to see. "Probably for herself," Palmer said quietly. "Poor kid." Michael turned the girl back around. Up close, he could see she had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked exhausted beyond anything he had seen. "Do you speak English?" he asked. The girl shook her head. Michael pulled out his canteen and offered it to her. The girl stared at it as if it might explode. He pantomimed drinking. After a long moment, she accepted the canteen with trembling hands and took a small sip. Then she began to cry up behind my, not loud sobs, but quiet tears that streamed down her face as she drank. As if kindness was more shocking than cruelty would have been. More figures appeared at the cave entrance. Other women, other nurses following the first girl's lead. Hands up, unarmed, terrified but choosing survival over suicide. Morrison swore quietly. Well, I'll be damned. Palmer was already on the radio calling for medical support and interpreters. Get these women to the rear. Water, food, medical attention. And for God's sake, tell the guards to be respectful. Let's show them what Americans actually are. Michael escorted the girl who had come out first toward the designated collection point. She walked beside him quietly, occasionally glancing up, as if still uncertain whether this was real or some elaborate trap. He wished he could tell her that she was safe, that the worst was over, that the monsters she had been promised did not exist. But he could not speak her language, and she could not speak his. All they had was this moment, this walk through mud and rubble, this small act of choosing humanity over hate. It would have to be enough. The war would continue. More would die. The atomic bombs were still months away. But in this moment on this ridge, one young woman had chosen trust over fear, and one young soldier had chosen mercy over vengeance. It was not much, but it was something. And sometimes something was all you could hope for. The prisoner of war camp at Kadena had been built in 3 days on land that 2 months earlier had been a sugarcane field. Now it held over 5,000 Japanese prisoners, mostly soldiers, but also an increasing number of civilians caught in the battle's final days. The Himeyuri nurses occupied a separate compound within the larger camp, surrounded by barbed wire and watched by guards who had been specifically instructed about the Geneva Convention and what would happen if they violated it. Yoshiko Tanaka had been a prisoner for 11 days. The routine was simple and strange. Wake at dawn, roll call, breakfast of rice and tinned meat that tasted like nothing she had ever eaten. Work detail, usually laundry or food preparation. Lunch, more work, dinner. Evening roll call, lights out at 2100. No one had heard her. No one had even touched her inappropriately. The guards kept their distance, some looking uncomfortable, others curious, a few hostile but restrained by the camp's commanding officer who took the rules seriously. It was disorienting. Everything she had been taught said this should not be possible. American soldiers were supposed to be animals. Yet they brought food and water. They provided medical care for the girls who were sick. They had even erected a shelter against the spring rains. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Either her entire education had been a lie, or this was an elaborate deception before the real horrors began. Yoshiko did not know which frightened her more. On her 12th day in captivity, everything changed. The guards had set up an interview station near the camp administration building, a simple tent with a table and chairs where intelligence officers questioned prisoners about Japanese defenses and military positions. Yoshiko had been through 2 sessions already. The questions were professional. The interpreter, a Nisei soldier who spoke perfect Japanese but whose eyes held sadness when he looked at the prisoners. Today was different. Today, when Yoshiko was brought to the tent, there was a woman waiting. She was American, clearly tall and fair-haired, with the confident bearing of someone used to authority. But she wore a medical uniform, not military, and her expression when she looked at Yoshiko was not interrogation but concern. "My name is Major Sarah Brennan," the woman said through the Nisei interpreter. "I am a nurse like you. I would like to talk to you about medical matters, not military ones. Is that acceptable?" Yoshiko nodded slowly, still wary. Sarah gestured to a chair. "Please sit. Would you like water, tea, if we have any?" The interpreter relayed this. Yoshiko sat but shook her head about the drinks. Accepting hospitality felt like betrayal, though she could not articulate of what or whom. Sarah seemed to understand the hesitation. She sat down across the table, her posture open and non-threatening. "I have read the reports about the Himeyuri Student Corps. Young women drafted to serve as nurses with minimal training, sent into combat zones. That must have been terrifying." Yoshiko said nothing. The interpreter waited patiently. Sarah tried again. "In my country, we have military nurses too, women who volunteer to serve. But we train them properly. We give them the equipment they need. We try not to put them in situations where they will be killed." She paused. "I am sorry that your government did not do the same for you." Something inside Yoshiko cracked. This American nurse, this enemy, was apologizing to her for her own government's failures. "We served the emperor," Yoshiko said quietly. The interpreter translated. "I am sure you did. with great courage. Sarah's voice was gentle. But courage does not require suffering. You should have been protected, not used. Yoshiko felt tears threatening and fought them back. Why do you care? We are your enemies. You are my patients, Sarah corrected. Or you would be if you needed medical attention. Are any of the girls sick? I have noticed some coughing in the compound. Masako has what you might call tuberculosis. Yuki has an infected wound on her leg that will not heal. Chio cannot keep food down and grows weaker every day. Sarah was already taking notes. I will examine them this afternoon. We have antibiotics, real food proper bandages. They do not have to suffer. Why? The question burst from Yoshiko before she could stop it. Why are you being kind? We are Japanese. We killed your people. You should hate us. Sarah set down her pen and looked directly at Yoshiko. Some Americans do hate you. The ones who lost family, the ones who saw friends die. Their hatred is understandable. But hatred is not policy. My job is to heal people, not to judge them. And you are not the enemy. The war is the enemy. You are just another victim of it. The interpreter translated this carefully, and Yoshiko heard the conviction in Sarah's voice, even through the language barrier. I do not understand America, Yoshiko admitted. In Japan, enemies are enemies. There is no mercy in defeat. Then I am sorry for what Japan has taught you, Sarah said, because mercy is what separates civilization from barbarism. And if we lose that, the war has defeated us all, regardless of which flag flies at the end. For the first time since her capture, Yoshiko felt something other than fear or confusion. She felt the faint stirring of hope, dangerous, fragile hope that perhaps the world could be different than she had been told. Across the camp in the guards' barracks, Michael Chen was learning a different lesson about translation. He had been assigned to guard duty at the women's compound on a rotating basis. The work was boring but tense. The prisoners watched the guards with the same wary fear that the guards watched the prisoners. No one quite trusted the situation. On his fifth shift, Michael noticed one of the girls standing near the wire fence, looking out toward the ocean. She was small and thin, with short, dark hair and a haunted expression that reminded him of refugees he had seen in photographs from Europe. He did not know why he spoke to her. Maybe boredom, maybe curiosity, maybe the same impulse that had made him offer water to the first girl they had captured. Nice view, he said in English, knowing she would not understand, but somehow needing to break the silence. The girl turned, startled. She looked at him for a long moment, then said something in Japanese. Michael shook his head and pointed to himself. English, sorry. The girl seemed to think about this. Then she pointed to the ocean and said, Umi. Michael understood. Ocean, sea. Ocean, he repeated in English, pointing the same direction. The girl's eyes lit up slightly. Ocean, she tried her pronunciation careful. Yeah, that's right, ocean. Michael smiled encouragingly. Over the next hour, they went through a halting exchange of words. Sky, cloud, bird, tree. The girl was intelligent, catching on quickly, and seemed almost hungry for the distraction. Michael found himself enjoying the challenge of communication without shared language. When his shift ended, he realized he did not know her name. He pointed to himself. Michael, the girl pointed to herself. Yoshiko. Yoshiko, Michael repeated, trying to get the pronunciation right. Nice to meet you, Yoshiko. She did not understand the phrase, but she smiled slightly. It was the first time Michael had seen any of the prisoners smile. The next day, he brought a notebook and pencil. When Yoshiko came to the fence again, he showed her written English words alongside his pronunciations. She wrote Japanese characters in return. They had no common written language, but the act of trying to communicate seemed important to both of them. Other guards noticed. Some thought Michael was foolish, wasting time on the enemy. Others, including Sergeant Morrison, were more pragmatic. Keep it up, Chen, Morrison said. Command wants us to show these folks we're civilized. Teaching them English is about as civilized as it gets. Lieutenant Palmer actively encouraged the interaction. He started bringing books from the small library that had been established for American personnel. Simple books. Children's books sometimes with pictures and basic vocabulary. If they're going to be repatriated, eventually speaking English might help them, Palmer reasoned. And if they stay, they will need it. Either way, learning is better than sitting around in fear. Yoshiko proved to be an excellent student. Within 2 weeks, she could handle basic conversations. Within a month, she was helping other girls learn. The compound began to transform from a silent, fearful place into something else. Not comfortable, never that, but less like a prison and more like a strange kind of school. The breakthrough came on June 7th, nearly 6 weeks after Yoshiko's capture. Sarah had been treating Masako for tuberculosis, bringing medicine daily, and monitoring her progress. The girl was improving, gaining weight, coughing less. It was undeniable medical success. But Masako was also the most hostile of the prisoners. She refused to speak to Sarah directly, answering questions only through interpreters, and even then with obvious reluctance. She wore her hatred like armor. On June 7th, Masako collapsed during work detail. Heat exhaustion compounded by her weakened state. Sarah was called immediately and arrived to find the girl unconscious on the ground. Other prisoners clustered around her in panic. Sarah went into automatic medical mode. Check breathing, check pulse, get her into shade, cool her down, start an IV for fluids. The prisoners watched with wide eyes as Sarah worked with quick efficiency, barking orders at her assistant nurses. 20 minutes later, Masako opened her eyes. She looked up at Sarah, confused and disoriented. "You are going to be fine," Sarah said gently through Yoshiko, who had become the camp's unofficial translator. "Heat exhaustion. You need rest and fluids." Masako's eyes filled with tears. "Why do you keep saving me?" Sarah paused in adjusting the IV line. "Because that is what doctors do. We save people." "But I hate you. I hate all Americans. My brother died at Iwo Jima." "I am sorry for your loss," Sarah said quietly. "Truly, but your brother's death does not require your death. And my job does not change based on whether you hate me. Healing is not conditional." Masako turned her face away, but she did not pull away from Sarah's care. It was a small thing, but it was something. That evening, Yoshiko asked Sarah a question that had been building for weeks. "In America, how do you decide who deserves help?" Sarah considered this. They were in the medical tent, Sarah cleaning instruments, while Yoshiko helped a routine that had developed naturally over their many conversations. "Everyone deserves help," Sarah said. "That is the principle anyway. In practice, we fail sometimes. We have prejudice, racism, inequality. We are not perfect, but the ideal is that human dignity is universal." "Japan teaches that only Japanese have true souls," Yoshiko said quietly. "That other people are lesser. That is why we could justify the war. But if that is false, if you are humans too, then everything we did was wrong." "Yes," Sarah said simply, "it was wrong, but that does not make you wrong, Yoshiko. You were taught lies. Recognizing them now takes courage." Yoshiko was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I want to help. When girls come in from other camps, other caves, they will be afraid like I was. I can tell them it is safe. I can translate. I can help them understand." Sarah put down the instrument she was cleaning and looked at Yoshiko fully. "You are willing to do that, to be a bridge between your people and mine." "I am willing to try." "Then I would be honored to work with you." They shook hands American style. Yoshiko's hand was small and Sarah's larger one, but her grip was firm. A partnership born from the ruins of war, fragile but real. Over the following weeks, Yoshiko proved invaluable. As more prisoners arrived from the outlying areas where fighting continued, she was there to meet them, speaking their language, explaining that the propaganda was false, showing by example that survival was possible. Many still chose death. The fear ran too deep, the indoctrination too complete. Yoshiko would hear the explosions from grenades, the shots from pistols, and she would have to live with knowing she could not save everyone. But some listened. Some chose the harder path of trusting their former enemies. And slowly the women's compound grew from 50 to 100 to nearly 200 souls, choosing survival over suicide. Michael watched this transformation with something like awe. The frightened girl he had first seen emerging from the cave had become a leader, someone other prisoners looked to for guidance. Her English improved daily. She began to smile more often. She even laughed sometimes, usually at Michael's terrible attempts to pronounce Japanese words. One evening in late June, as the sun set over the Pacific and the war entered its final brutal months, Michael and Yoshiko sat on opposite sides of the fence, sharing a quiet moment after a long day. "Can I ask you something?" Michael said. "Yes." "When you walked out of that cave with your hands up, were you afraid?" Yoshiko was quiet for a moment. "Terrified. I was certain I would die." What made you do it anyway? She thought about this, searching for the right English words. I decided that if I must die, I want to die knowing truth, not living in lies. Even if truth is terrible, it is better than comfortable lies. And was it terrible, the truth? Yoshiko looked at him, this young American soldier who had shown her kindness when he could have shown cruelty. The truth is complicated. Your country has done bad things too. I know this now. But you personally, Michael Chen, you have been kind. Major Brennan has been kind. That is truth also. Do you think people back in Japan will believe that? When the war ends and you go home, I do not know if I can go home, Yoshiko admitted. In Japan, prisoners are shameful. We were supposed to die rather than surrender. My family may reject me. Then stay here. After the war, make a new life. Yoshiko smiled sadly. America is not my home. I do not belong here. Maybe not yet, but you could. You are learning the language, the customs. You could build something new. Maybe, Yoshiko said, though her tone suggested she did not believe it. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell. In the distance, artillery rumbled. The battle for Okinawa was nearly over, but the war continued. Somewhere in laboratories in New Mexico, scientists were preparing weapons that would change everything. Somewhere in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito was beginning to understand that defeat was inevitable. But in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was two young people from opposite sides of a terrible war learning to see each other as human. Learning that translation was possible not just of language, but of understanding. It was not enough to end wars, but it was enough to survive them. And sometimes that had to be sufficient. August 6, 1945, began like any other day at the Kadena prisoner of war camp. Yoshiko woke at dawn, helped with breakfast preparation, and was preparing for her morning English class, with the newer arrivals when the news came through. The Americans had dropped something on Hiroshima, a bomb unlike anything before. The entire city destroyed in a single blast. The camp fell into stunned silence. Prisoners and guards alike could not comprehend the magnitude. One bomb, one city. The numbers were too large to process. 70,000 dead, the early reports said. Later estimates would climb higher. Yoshiko sat in the medical tent numb with shock. Sarah found her there an hour later staring at nothing. Did you have family in Hiroshima? Sarah asked gently. Yoshiko shook her head. Osaka. But she struggled for words. So many people, so many lives, just gone. Sarah sat beside her. I know, it is incomprehensible. Is this what you meant by American civilization, killing thousands in seconds? The question was bitter angry. Sarah did not flinch from it. No, this is what I meant about all of us being capable of terrible things, America included. Sarah's voice was heavy. The men who designed that bomb are probably telling themselves it will save lives by ending the war. Maybe they are right. Maybe it will force surrender and prevent a mainland invasion that would kill millions. But that does not make it less terrible. And if Japan does not surrender, if they drop more bombs? Sarah had no answer. 3 days later, Nagasaki provided one. Another city, another 70,000 souls. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio for the first time in Japanese history. His announcement of surrender was wrapped in formal language, but the meaning was clear. Japan had lost. The war was over. In the women's compound, reactions varied. Some prisoners wept with relief. Others wept with shame. A few spoke quietly of suicide, though by now most had learned to choose survival. Yoshiko felt only emptiness, a vast hollow, where her entire understanding of the world had been. Michael found her by the fence that evening, the same spot where they had shared so many conversations. You okay? He asked. I do not know, Yoshiko admitted. My country has lost everything. My education was lies. My government sacrificed millions for nothing. What is left? You are left. Everyone here is left. You can rebuild. Into what? What does Japan become now? Michael sat down in the dust on his side of the fence. I don't know, but I know what you can become. You have become a teacher here, a translator, someone who helps frightened people find courage. That does not disappear because the war ended. Yoshiko was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Major Brennan asked me if I want to work with the occupation forces as a translator and cultural liaison. She says they will need people who understand both Japanese and American ways. What did you tell her? I said I would think about it. But Michael, my family may disown me. In Japan, prisoners are dishonored, especially women prisoners. We should have died rather than be captured. That is what they will say. Maybe. Or maybe they will be grateful you survived. Maybe they will listen when you tell them that Americans are not monsters, that peace is possible. You have such faith in people. I have faith in you, Michael said simply. You walked out of that cave when you could have killed yourself. You chose to learn English when you could have stayed silent. You chose to help other prisoners when you could have stayed isolated. Every time you had a choice, you picked courage over fear. Why stop now? Yoshiko felt tears streaming down her face. Because I am tired. Because I want to go home, but I do not know where home is anymore. Then make a new home, here or Japan or somewhere else entirely. But do it knowing you have something valuable to offer. You have lived through the worst, and you came out still human. That matters. They sat together as the sun set, not speaking, but finding comfort in shared silence. Around them, the camp was transforming. Already there was talk of repatriation, of processing prisoners to return home, of the massive effort to rebuild two nations from the ashes of war. Over the next 3 months, as autumn turned to winter, the camp slowly emptied. The first ships left in September, carrying prisoners back to a Japan that existed only in memory now. Occupied by Americans, cities destroyed, economies shattered, everything familiar gone. Yoshiko made her decision in October. She would stay through the initial occupation, work as a translator, help rebuild bridges between Japanese civilians and American forces. For how long, she did not know. Maybe a year, maybe longer. You could apply for permanent residency, Sarah suggested. Come to America, study nursing properly, build a life. Yoshiko was tempted. America represented freedom, possibility, all the things her old world had denied. But it also represented abandonment, turning her back on her people when they needed understanding most. I need to go back eventually, Yoshiko said, but not yet. First, I need to show them that the enemy was not what we thought, that there is another way. Sarah understood. Then I will help however I can. The two women had become genuine friends over the months. Sarah taught Yoshiko advanced medical techniques. Yoshiko taught Sarah Japanese language and customs. They spoke honestly about the war's horrors and their complicity in systems they had not chosen but had served nonetheless. Do you think we can be forgiven, Yoshiko asked one day as they worked in the clinic, for what our countries did? I think forgiveness is less important than learning, Sarah replied. If we learn from this, if we build something better because we understand what went wrong, maybe that is redemption enough. Michael's deployment ended in November. He would be returning to California, to a family he had not seen in 2 years, to a life he could barely remember. On his last day, he gave Yoshiko a gift, a book of American poetry, including works by the Chinese American poets who had fought to be heard in a country that did not always welcome them. So you remember that America is complicated too, he said. Not perfect, but trying. Yoshiko gave him something in return, a small crane folded from paper, traditional Japanese origami. For peace, she said, and for remembering that enemies can become friends. They shook hands formally, both understanding that some friendships exist in specific moments and cannot survive the transition back to normal life. But that did not make them less real or less valuable. Take care of yourself, Yoshiko Tanaka. Change the world. Take care of yourself, Michael Chen. Remember what you learned here. After he left, Yoshiko stood at the fence for a long time, watching the empty space where he had stood. Then she turned back to the clinic, to the work that awaited, to the future that was uncertain but no longer terrifying. The occupation of Japan brought its own challenges. Yoshiko worked with American military government teams translating orders and explaining cultural contexts. She helped set up schools and medical clinics. She watched Japan transform from enemy to ally, from proud empire to defeated nation to something new and undefined. She saw American soldiers being kind and American soldiers being cruel. She saw Japanese civilians who welcomed the occupiers and Japanese civilians who seethed with resentment. She learned that truth was never simple, that no nation was entirely good or evil, that individuals mattered more than flags. In the spring of 1946, Yoshiko received a letter from her mother. It had taken months to arrive, routed through Red Cross channels. The handwriting was shaky-aged. "My daughter," it read, "we thought you were dead. The official notice said you died serving the emperor at Okinawa. We held funeral services. We mourned. But an American officer visited last week and said you were alive, working with the occupation forces." "Is this true?" Yoshiko wrote back, immediately explaining everything. The capture, the camp, the decision to survive, the work she was doing now. She expected rejection, shame, disownment. The response came 2 months later. "Come home," her mother wrote. "We want to see you. Whatever happened, whatever you did, you are still our daughter. The war is over. Let us be a family again." In July, Yoshiko took a train to Osaka. The city was largely destroyed, rebuilding slowly from American firebombing raids. Her family home had survived, though the neighborhood around it was rubble. Her mother opened the door and immediately began crying. They held each other for a long time, not speaking, just reconnecting across the gulf of separation and war. Over tea, Yoshiko told her story. Her mother listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, mostly just absorbing the magnitude of what her daughter had endured. "I was afraid you would think I brought shame to the family," Yoshiko admitted. Her mother shook her head. "You survived. That is not shame, that is strength. But I surrendered. I helped the enemy. You helped people. There is no shame in that." Her mother poured more tea. "The war taught us many lies. That dying was more important than living, that enemies were monsters, that our leaders were infallible. All lies. If you learn the truth earlier than most, that makes you wise, not shameful." They talked long into the night, about the past, about the future, about what Japan would become in this strange new world, where Americans were occupiers but also allies, where the emperor had revealed himself to be human, where everything certain had become uncertain. "Will you stay?" her mother asked. In Japan, Yoshiko did not know. "For now, but I am thinking about studying in America, learning proper medicine, coming back to help rebuild." "Then do it. The world is open to you now in ways it never was before. Use that freedom wisely." Over the next several years, Yoshiko did exactly that. She continued working with occupation forces while studying at night. She applied to American nursing schools and was accepted to several. She chose one in California partly because Michael had mentioned it was where his family lived, though she had lost contact with him and did not expect to find him again. In 1948, she boarded a ship to America, this time as a student, not a prisoner. The journey took 2 weeks. Yoshiko spent much of it on deck, watching the ocean and thinking about the journey she had made from the caves of Okinawa to this moment. Sarah met her at the dock in San Francisco. The older nurse had returned to America after the war and was now teaching at the university hospital where Yoshiko would study. "Welcome home," Sarah said, embracing her. "This is not my home," Yoshiko replied, but she was smiling. "Not yet, but it could be." Yoshiko's years in America were challenging. Language barriers remained despite her fluency. Cultural differences created constant misunderstandings. Some Americans treated her with suspicion or hostility, unable to separate her from the wartime enemy. Others were kind but patronizing, expecting her to be grateful for every small courtesy. But she persevered. She excelled in her studies. She became a registered nurse in 1951, specializing in trauma care. She worked at veterans' hospitals treating American soldiers wounded in Korea, the next war in the endless cycle. Some of the veterans recognized her accent and refused her care. Others did not care. One elderly man, a survivor of Bataan, asked her where she was from. When she told him, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "War is over now. You did not torture me. I appreciate the good nursing." It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement of shared humanity. It was enough. In 1953, Yoshiko was invited to speak at a conference on war trauma and cultural healing. The audience was mostly medical professionals, but there were also veterans and peace activists and people simply interested in understanding. She told her story. The cave at Okinawa, the surrender, the camp, the choice to survive and learn rather than die in ignorance, the work of translation and bridge building. After her talk, a man approached her, older now but still recognizable. Michael Chen. "I heard you were speaking," he said. "I had to come." They embraced, laughing and crying at the same time. He had returned to school after the war, become a teacher, married a Japanese-American woman whose family had been interned during the war. They had 2 children. I never forgot what you taught me, Michael said, about choosing courage, about translation being possible. I have spent 10 years teaching high school students that enemies are just people we have not understood yet. Are they listening? Some are, that is all we can ask. Yoshiko had not married. Her work was her life. She dated occasionally but found it difficult to trust deeply after everything she had endured. Therapy helped, though the concept was still new, and she often felt like she was explaining herself to people who could not possibly understand. But she built a life. She had friends, colleagues, purpose. She returned to Japan regularly, maintaining connections even as she put down roots in America. She existed between worlds, belonging fully to neither, but finding value in that liminal space. Sarah remained a close friend until her death in 1968. At the funeral, Yoshiko gave the eulogy, speaking about the nurse who had shown her that healing was the only appropriate response to suffering. She could have hated us, Yoshiko said to the gathered mourners. Her husband died at Pearl Harbor. She had every reason to see Japanese prisoners as the enemy, but she chose to see us as patients, as people. That choice saved my life. Not physically, though she did that too, but spiritually. She showed me that the monsters I feared were human, and in doing so, she showed me that I was human too. The 1970s brought a reckoning for both nations. America grappled with Vietnam, another war in Asia, another failure to understand the people they fought. Japan grappled with its own war guilt, slowly acknowledging atrocities that had been hidden or denied. Yoshiko watched all of this with the weary wisdom of someone who had lived through one war and understood that humanity seemed incapable of learning from its mistakes. But she also saw progress. She saw Japanese Americans who had been interned during the war fighting for recognition and reparations. She saw Vietnam veterans organizing for peace. She saw young people from both countries building friendships and partnerships that crossed the old divides. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, Yoshiko was invited to speak at a memorial service on Okinawa. She had not returned to the island since her capture. The cave where she had worked was now a memorial site, preserved, sanctified, a reminder of what had happened there. Yoshiko stood at the entrance, remembering the darkness and fear and the choice she had made to walk into the light. She spoke to students from both Japan and America about the Himeyuri Student Corps, about the 222 young women who had been drafted to serve, about the 123 who had died, most by their own hands, rather than face capture. They were told that death was preferable to dishonor, Yoshiko said. But what they were not told is that survival takes more courage than suicide, that living with difficult truths takes more strength than dying for comfortable lies. Those who died were not cowards, but those of us who survived were not cowards either. We chose the harder path. After the ceremony, a young Japanese woman approached her. She was a student at the university studying to be a nurse. My grandmother was in the Himeyuri Corps, she said. She survived too. She has never spoken about it. But I want to understand. Can you help me? Yoshiko took the young woman's hand. I can try. They sat on a bench overlooking the Pacific, and Yoshiko told the stories. Not just her own, but those of the girls who had not survived. The names and faces that haunted her still. The moments of courage and despair. The weight of survival when so many had not. Does it get easier? The young woman asked. The guilt of surviving? No, Yoshiko admitted, but it becomes bearable. You learn to carry it. You learn to honor the dead by living well, by being the person they did not get to become. Yoshiko Tanaka died in 2006 at the age of 85. She was working at the clinic until 2 weeks before her death, still seeing patients, still teaching young nurses, still believing that healing mattered. Her memorial service was held in both California and Osaka. Students spoke, colleagues spoke, patients spoke, and at the California service, an elderly man stood to share his story. My name is Michael Chen, he said. I met Yoshiko in 1945 during the Battle of Okinawa. I was a scared kid with a rifle. She was a scared kid in a nurse's uniform. We were supposed to be enemies. But she taught me that enemies are just people you have not tried to understand yet. That lesson changed my life. He held up a paper crane yellowed with age but still intact. She gave me this 61 years ago, for peace, for remembering. I have carried it every day since. and I will carry it until I join her wherever we go when this life ends. Because some friendships transcend war. Some lessons transcend nationality. Some truths transcend time. The crane was buried with Michael when he died 2 years later. His family honored his wish that it be placed in his coffin, a symbol of the connection that had shaped his life. Yoshiko's legacy lived on in the hundreds of nurses she had trained, the thousands of patients she had treated, the countless lives she had touched through her work and her story. Medical schools used her memoir as a teaching text on cultural sensitivity and the ethics of care. Peace organizations cited her as an example of reconciliation being possible. But perhaps the greatest legacy was simpler. It was in the small acts of kindness that rippled outward from that moment on a ridge in Okinawa when one frightened young woman chose to trust and one frightened young soldier chose to help. Those choices had not ended war. They had not prevented future conflicts or dissolved the barriers between nations. But they had proven that even in the darkest moments, human connection was possible, that enemies could become friends, that translation was not just of language, but of understanding. And in a world that seemed determined to divide itself into us and them, that truth remained vital. A reminder that the distance between enemy and ally, between monster and human, between war and peace was sometimes only a single choice. The choice to extend water instead of violence. The choice to heal instead of hate. The choice to see the human in the other. It was not enough to save the world, but it was enough to save a soul. And sometimes that had to be sufficient.